Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of Geeks Not Nerds, the podcast. I'm Captain Logan, and with me today is Ken Keller. Ken is the co-founder of KC Fandom in the Kansas City area and of the Kansas City Science Fiction and Fantasy Society, which I've been involved with now here and there for the last couple of years, and I've been getting to know Ken quite well lately. And he's been talking my ear off about all kinds of comic book and science fiction things, and telling me about things I never knew about, going all the way back to the 50s. The Kansas City Science Fiction and Fantasy Society hosts the sci-fi literary convention Conquest every year, and I've been doing panels on that for the last couple of years also. Ken is the past chair of the annual World Science Fiction Convention, which started in '39 and is the precursor to all fan cons. He's been in comics fandom since its early days, starting in '63, and he's been involved with fandom for 50 years. Welcome to the program, Ken.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this. We've been talking about doing this podcast for quite a while.
Today, Ken and I are going to talk at length about comics fandom and also about Star Wars. Ken has a really fascinating story to tell us here in a little bit about his first exposure to Star Wars, and I will say nothing else about that until we get to it. Ken, let's start with your introduction to comics fandom. How did you get into all of this? How did you start doing conventions, going to conventions, and especially being in charge of things in the circuit?
Well, it was a long process. It really all began just by chance. A good friend of mine, Edmund Lowe, when I was in high school, was a comic collector, and at that point I was not. I had read comics, of course, in the 50s and the 60s, but I wouldn't certainly call myself a large fan of them or a collector. At that time, I was living in Santa Ana, California. Now, I was living there because my dad was in the aerospace business, and he worked for North American Aviation at that time, but he had started in San Diego. And I first moved to San Diego in 1956, late 1956, shortly after seeing Forbidden Planet, I might add, the classic 1956 science fiction film, which made me a science fiction fan forever. But that's a long story, and I'm getting off the track.
Was that your first science fiction film?
No. Actually, my first science fiction film was the Howard Hawks' The Thing from Another World.
Oh, was it? Okay.
From 1951. And the only thing I vividly remember about that, and you have to understand, I was born in 1948. I'm 65 right now. So that would have made me about 2.5 years old. The only thing that I remember about that is throwing up in the lobby of the theater probably sometime halfway through the movie. And analyzing it years later, I think it was the Dmitri Tiomkin soundtrack that scared me. And so that was my first inoculation of science fiction. And of course, I was doomed to be a science fiction fan my entire life, although I didn't realize that. And then later on, as I got older, I saw films like The Tarantula, big bug movie, George Powell's classic War of the Worlds, I saw when it came out, loved it. And the last science fiction film I saw before moving to California was MGM's classic Forbidden Planet, which has remained a perennial favorite. And I could tell you some great stories about that, but we don't have time. That'll be for another podcast.
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. About 1963, my friend Edmund asked me, because he knew that my folks and I went back to San Diego frequently, and that my dad liked to go to the used bookstores in Kansas City, in San Diego, where he bought various and sundry things. And so Ed asked me if I would pick up some comics for him. And having been a comics reader, small comics reader, I said, sure, I'll be happy to do it. I was usually bored to death while my dad shopped for hours on end. So I said, give me a list of what you want. And he says, no, don't worry about it. Just pick up whatever looks interesting. He didn't want to go to the trouble because at that point he had a medium-sized comic collection, which in the Silver Age meant probably a couple of hundred. You know, we're talking the Silver Age of comics when things really started getting rolling. So he left it pretty much up to me to buy whatever looked good, and he was only interested in reading DC comics. So flash forward, we go to San Diego, and I'm going through, and I go upstairs to this little loft area where they keep all the comics, and there's just piles and piles and piles and sackfuls of comics. And I said, my God, it'll take me hours to go through this. So I dutifully went through it, and I was very careful. And I had a budget, so I was careful to pick anything that was reasonably priced. And we're talking like 20 cents or 25 cents for a comic book. Hard to believe the comics were ever that cheap, but yes, they were, even used. And I did pick out, because he was a collector, good condition comics, and he was the first to actually kind of show me what a good condition comic meant. So after a while, I wound up selecting about 3 bags full, grocery sacks full of comics. And I just hoped that Ed didn't have any of these. Well, as it turned out, when I got back to Santa Ana, he went through, and it turned out that about half of them he didn't have. The others he did have. And he took the best condition copies of the two, and most of those were the ones that he had already bought already, and he gave the rest to me. Well, here I had 2 sacks of comic books to read.
Can you remember any titles at all?
Oh, there was Green Lantern, Justice League, there was The Flash, there was...
So it was all DC?
It was all DC Comics. He didn't want to...
That's all he cared about.
That's all he cared about.
Also all you
and I, at that point, didn't know about Marvel Comics. In fact, I might have seen some Marvel Comics, but if they weren't DC Comics...
Well, how early did you say this was?
This would have to be 1963, early 63.
Yeah, well, and Marvel would have been just getting started.
Marvel started in 61. In fact, as a sidebar story before I continue,
sure,
I can remember going to a newsstand.
Or rather, for people that don't know, Marvel, when it turned into Marvel, before or after it was Timely.
After it was Timely Comics. And up to the time they started superhero comics, they had been known for their monster comics.
Yeah.
And they did some great stuff. I used to read those. I love those because I loved monster movies. But as a quick sidebar, I remember going to a newsstand in 1961 with my dad, and I remember seeing in wire about 25 copies of Fantastic Four #1. If I could only go back in time and say, I'll take all of those, it would have been like $2.50 because it was a 10-cent comic book.
And you would have
look in the Overstreet price guide for what that is currently selling for. And these would have all been in mint condition. But of course, I had no clue what I was looking at.
Of course. Nobody did.
Nobody did.
Otherwise, they wouldn't be worth what they are.
But ultimately, I would find a copy of Fantastic Four #1. I think I paid $2 for it.
Oh, so you did have one?
So I did have one. Yes, I had complete runs. I had complete runs of all of DC, all of Marvel, and all the related superhero comics.
Now, how early in your life did you unfortunately part with those?
Well, I sold them slowly to start a business in 1975. I started the typesetting and graphic design business.
And by then they would have already been worth.
Oh, they were well worth a good deal of money. Of course, they're worth a good deal more now.
Right.
And I used that money to start a business, which I had for about 7 years. But again, we're getting kind of ahead of ourselves.
Yeah. I was just curious.
So I began reading the DC comics, loved them. They kind of rang a bell inside my head. And for about a year or so, I was strictly a DC reader and collector. And slowly but surely, I started collecting comics. Now, I've always had a predilection for collecting things. And I'm certain your listeners know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Because a comic fan who doesn't have piles and piles and stacks of comics in boxes with backing boards and so forth isn't really a collector. In fact, I've been collecting things my entire life, and I have a whole house full of stuff that I could show you. In fact, I have this joke that I say about myself. It says, I don't collect, the collection collects me. I'm surrounded by all kinds of stuff, and I still do collect a few comics now and then, and we can get to that a little bit later.
Sure, yeah.
Well, anyway, after I became a comics reader and started to become a serious collector, I began to realize that I had kind of been missing out on something, and I kept looking at these Marvel comics, kind of eyeballing them suspiciously because they weren't DC and they looked quite different.
They were?
And in fact, they indeed were. And at some point, and I don't remember exactly when, I picked up a few and started reading them, and bam! That was it. I was hooked instantly, and I became a huge Marvel fan. And from that point on, I started collecting all the superhero titles that were published. Now, let me set the stage here. In early 1963, there were no comic book shops anywhere. They weren't even thought of. They weren't even imagined yet. You had to buy your comics on newsstands, in grocery stores, in department stores that had magazine racks or small newsstands. You could buy them at newsstands. And if you were a kid and couldn't drive, it was sometimes very difficult if you decided you were going to read the entire superhero canon that was being produced from the comics industry. And so it became very difficult at times to keep up with my collection, but slowly but surely I was able to. But it was a task. It became my big hobby. I only dreamed that there was one or two places I could go to and buy everything.
Yeah.
So comics fans today don't realize how easy they've got it. Although
to be fair, it's harder to collect everything now than it was back then.
Well, there's a lot.
Because they're more expensive and they publish more.
They publish more, and of course you have all the variant covers.
Well, especially if you want to do it like a collector, like I know you do.
Yes,
I
do.
Everything. I gotta say this real quick. Ken buys every cover of everything he collects practically.
Yes,
like Ken collects the Shadow, and he buys this Dynamite stuff. And Dynamite, if you know anything about them, they like to publish 7 or 8 covers
at least. And now they've started a very limited series where there'll be 25 copies of one cover, 50 copies of one cover, and 100 copies of another cover. And the 25 copies are about $200 a piece. Well, that's just a...
Oh, are they really?
Yeah.
I didn't know they were that high.
That's a bridge too far. In fact, if I had been smart, I would have just collected the main retail covers, what they call usually the A through D or the A through E covers.
Right.
That would have been a much saner idea, but once I started down that track, so what I've done is I've got the generally available covers, except those extremely super limiteds, and of course they've also done these comic shop variants. I'll give you an example: Masks series that Dynamite published, which is all of Masks' pulp heroes combined into kind of a Justice League of America in the 1930s fighting crime. They did, for the first cover alone, there were 25 store variants. There was a billboard on the front of the comic in which the comic shop or online seller could have his name emblazoned, and there were 25 different retail outlets that participated in this. So in addition to the A through F or G covers, there were these additional 25. It became madness. I decided I was going to try and get all of those, and after about 11 or 12, I just threw in the towel. I just said, that's just way too much, because some of these were costing $15, $20 a piece. It was the same cover, except there was a different comic shop name published on the front of it. So that I quickly burned out on that, and the additional ones that they did for that and other Dynamite series where they actually have hand-drawn covers, which has been this has been around for quite a while.
Yeah.
There were some of these that were selling for $300, $400, $500, $600 a pop.
Wow.
And I'm thinking that's a pretty rarefied collector's atmosphere, and it's way beyond how I want to invest. Now, I don't consider myself a comics collector because I'm in denial. But I do, but I do collect as you said, the Rocketeer and any of the Dynamite comics that have the Shadow character. And there's a reason for both of those.
All the pulp stuff.
Some of the pulp stuff. I've been a reader of the Shadow since his revival in 1963, and when DC was doing them in the 70s and the 80s, I was buying those comics, and those only had one cover each. So those were a piece of cake, by comparison. But I'm not complaining. I understand that the comics market is collector-driven. It's always been collector-driven.
And as long as we have it in print, it always will be.
It will be in print.
Yeah.
And I do realize that you can get downloaded versions if you just want to read the stories. The downloads
and trade paperbacks.
And
we have a lot of listeners that just read that way. Either just trades or just digital. And and we're speaking Greek to those folks. They don't understand.
They think we're crazy.
Why would you spend that much money on this kind of stuff? Yeah, and I don't go anything like as far as you do. I'm good with if I can get one cover of the thing.
You have to understand that I've been, as I said, on the Shadow alone, I've been collecting the Shadow since his revival in 1963. So I'm and being a collector, I mean, collectors collect, capital C. I'm a collector, capital C.
Yeah.
And at first, when I started thinking of, when I saw all these alternate covers coming out, I thought, I'll just buy the one I like the best. I bought that one. That wasn't satisfying enough because I knew there were other variants out there. And
it helps that you have so much going back so far that you had a complete collection.
Yeah.
And they put more stuff out, so you're a completist with particular characters.
Well, now I'm not a completist because then the hand-drawn...
You're almost a completist.
The hand-drawn... I've been able to pick up a few of the lesser expensive hand-drawn covers that I liked, and in many cases they're one-of-a-kind pieces of artwork, so each hand-drawn cover is different. But there were some that were done as a series, that were done... They were pretty much the same cover, maybe slight variations by the artist. But those have gotten this has gotten so out of hand and so expensive just on these few titles that I collect. And Dynamite by no means is those are not the only titles that they do this on. They do this for a number of their titles.
Yeah, that's right.
IDW does multiple covers.
But not nearly as many.
Not really as
most of the time.
Most of the time. Well, the Rocketeers now settled into just 2 alternate covers.
Although then you have that crazy thing where they've been going to we're getting way off track, but they're going to some tops to some old tops characters now.
Right.
Like they're going to Mars Attacks and stuff. And so the first issue, when they do those, they'll go back to the old card sets,
right?
And they'll do a variant cover for every card that got put out. So Mars Attacks #1 has like 52 variant covers.
Yes, I remember reading that, and I thought that way lies madness. There must be some collectors who must feel like their hands are their wallets are being taken out of their pockets all the time.
At least they did a box where you could buy all of it, and I think it might have been less expensive. I forget. Anyway, let's get back on track for a minute.
Okay, yeah.
Let's get us to the first convention you ever did.
Well, in order to get there, you have to understand that in the late 1960s, after I moved to Kansas City from San Diego, I started transitioning over into science fiction fandom, and it was around that time period, actually it was a little earlier than that I discovered that comics fandom had actually spun out of the core of science fiction fandom, which had been going since 1930. Mm-hmm. And one of the key comic editors of that time period, Julie Swartz, DC Comics, was a big name fan, a member of First Fandom in science fiction fandom, had been Ray Bradbury's agent for years and knew a lot of the big names.
Oh, I didn't know he was Bradbury's
agent.
Oh, yes.
He was a Bradbury's agent for a while as when Bradbury was a young man. And so his connection to science fiction fandom was very strong. And the reason I discovered comics fandom was because Julie had started publishing the full addresses of the people who sent letters of comment. And if it hadn't been for him doing that, just like the early pulp magazines had done in their era, there would have been no comic fandom per se. There had been a small pseudo-comic fandom in the 50s devoted to EC Comics, and there were EC-only fanzines published. But they by no means constituted a big enough fandom to be a separate fandom of its own. But thanks to Julie starting that practice, comic fandom soon started, and the official beginning is technically believed to be Alter Ego #1 in 1961, published by Dr. Jerry Bales. And if it hadn't been for Dr. Bales, there would be no comics fandom. I would have probably not discovered science fiction fandom. I might have gone off into something completely different. And so to understand where I'm coming from, you have to understand that if these events had not happened, I couldn't have done what I have done.
Did you ever meet Julie Swartz?
Yes, I met Julie a number of times. And in fact, my most favorite moment was he used to give out Superman pins and Green Lantern pins. And a bunch of us in Kansas City had power rings made up from the pins. And at St. Louis's Archon, back about 20 years ago, a bunch of us stood around and charged our power rings on Julie Swartz's belly. And we recited the Green Lantern Oath.
Oh, that's awesome.
In unison together. And this was a way of thanking Julie for what he had done to help create comics fandom, for doing the things that he had done as a DC editor that we had all discovered as kids. And to a great degree, he was kind of a spiritual grandfather to all of us.
Oh, yeah.
And so being able to meet Julie before he died was quite an honor. And he's done a very nice history of comics and comics fandom. That was published shortly before his death that I highly recommend. I don't remember the title right off the top of my head. But
when did he pass away?
Oh, actually, Julie's probably been dead about 7-8 years now.
I was going to say, it hasn't been that long.
He lived a good long life. He did not pass away young. And his history straddling both science fiction and comics was pretty amazing. He's largely known as being comics associated, but his own fandom, his roots were in science fiction fandom, where mine have been for the last 40 years.
So let me ask you, did you go to the first San Diego Comic-Con?
No, and I'll tell you, there's a great story. I grew up in San Diego, as you know, which became the center of all comics. And who would have thunk it back in that era? I lived in San Diego, and I used to do things like I would go through some of the hotels downtown on my way to work, or especially on my way home from work, and imagine what it would be like to have a Comic-Con at these things, because by then, Comic-Cons were starting to happen in other parts of the country. Detroit, especially New York City, and I can tell you a great story about the first New York Comic-Con, and my friend George R. Martin, who was the first registrant at the very first Comic-Con. But that's another long story. And I used to imagine that what it would be like to have a comic convention. Well, it turned out, I moved from San Diego in 1969. A few years later, the Golden State Comic Convention happened in San Diego, which is the immediate precursor to Comic-Con. If those had not happened, Comic-Con would not have happened. And those early Comic-Cons were held in those very same hotels that I had walked through imagining what a Comic-Con would be like. There was something that I suspect that I was picking up something in the ether. I was foreshadowing something, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And this is not the only time this kind of thing has happened to me in my life. And so, no, I missed going to San Diego's very first convention. And I can tell you, if I had not moved from San Diego, I would have been heavily involved in the comics fandom that sprung up in the 1980s and did those early Comic-Cons.
What are the odds that you, of all people, would have been from there?
From there. And strangely enough, ironically, San Diego was a tough place to collect comics in because of the distribution system was very difficult. You had to really go down to Chula Vista, which is south of San Diego.
How did they ever become the epicenter?
I don't really know. I do know that if it hadn't been for, I'm trying to remember the guy that founded the Detroit Triple Fanfare, moved to San Diego and started the Golden State Comic Conventions, which very rapidly evolved into Comic-Con. But how San Diego became the epicenter of the comics field, I think, was a matter of chance and luck. Because you would think if that was going to happen, it would be like in New York or somewhere on the East Coast where comics were mostly situated.
And also where comics were being made.
And were being made, too. Sparta, Illinois is where comics used to be published. I thought maybe Chicago might have been an epicenter where comics got started. But no, it was San Diego, California, of all places. Well, now, of course, anyone who keeps up with what's happening in fandom knows that San Diego's the epicenter and has been for decades.
Yeah, and that's not only the biggest comic book convention, that's the biggest everything convention.
Yeah, in the United States. Although I'll tell you, DragonCon in Atlanta is really starting to give them a run for their money. This year they were over 60,000 people.
Oh, I didn't know DragonCon was that big now.
Oh yeah, it's gotten to be a huge citywide event. It brings in millions of dollars into Atlanta's coffers, just like San Diego does for their coffers. San Diego Comic-Con I've been to. I don't know if I could survive a modern Comic-Con. I've heard the various stories. If I was 20 years younger, maybe I might be able to survive it. But I did go to several Comic-Cons in the 1980s, back before the giant explosion happened, back when they were really Comic-Cons. And I had a great time there, and I met a number of artists and writers and some of the guys I'd been in comic fandom with, and I have very fond memories of those two Comic-Cons.
Have you been to Planet Comic-Con out here?
Yes, I have. I've been to some of the earlier incarnations when they were smaller.
They're pretty big now, too.
Oh, now.
Right, especially for this area.
This area, this year's Planet Comic-Con down at the convention center was 4,000 plus.
Yeah.
And that is astonishing to me that there is.
I thought it was bigger than that.
Was it? Maybe it was. I heard 4,000 plus, but it wouldn't surprise me if you're in a convention center.
I'll tell you, I was there, and it felt like more than that.
Well, more power to Kansas City. I'm very happy to see this. There's been a comics presence in Kansas City for quite some time. In fact, before there was the specialty comic book shops that really didn't emerge until after Phil Seuling started Direct Market in the 1970s, there was Clint's Books and Comics, which was although it was largely a bookstore, it carried a huge selection, carried all the comic books. And I knew Clint's Books back when it was a real bookstore and run by Clint Murray himself. And he was where I used to go all the time to buy all the comics after I moved to Kansas City. And I thought, what a great idea. I said, I wish other people would do this, have a shop devoted to comics and science fiction. Wow, what a great idea. And it wasn't too long thereafter that really started.
And we didn't really get an onslaught of that until, what would you say, early 80s, 83?
Yeah, I would say the after Phil Seuling started the direct market system and the independent distributors started happening, that's what started the whole explosion of comic book shops around the country. It really is. It's really been heartening to me to see how that changed. Those of us in early comic fandom could have never dreamed that such a thing would happen. It just goes to show you that once you start a popular medium, comics begin to snowball. We didn't realize that it was snowballing until we got to the Bronze Age in the 70s, and that's when things really radically started to change. And that's when all the independent comics emerged thanks to these distribution systems, comic distribution systems that existed at that point. But prior to that, independent comics just simply weren't there. They just weren't around. Now, there were the underground comics of the late 60s. Those were actually the precursors to the modern comic industry with all of its independent publishers.
Right.
If it hadn't really been, and most of those comics were distributed through head shops and through counterculture venues, and I can remember reading some of those. They were largely color covers, black and white interiors. Occasionally, you might see one story done in color, but mostly they were independent black and white comics with self-printed. Kitchen Sink Press, one of the big comics publishers, did underground comics, and is still a carryover.
Right.
So they were really the foundation for the independent movement in comics.
Would you mind, for our listeners, mentioning maybe a couple of comic creators that you know that are from this area? Or
comic fans, you mean?
Well, I thought you knew a few people that drew and wrote.
Well, yes, I did. The second comic book artist I ever met was Richard Corbin, who, of course, started in the underground comics in the 1960s. Richard still lives here in Kansas City. He's been a Kansas City resident his whole life. And I knew him when he was still working in the underground comic book movement. In fact, I'm a character in a couple of his stories.
Oh, really?
Yes, he liked to bring his friends out, and he'd shoot Polaroids and so forth of us, and then insert us as characters.
That's fun.
I'm in an H.P. Lovecraft story.
Are you really?
Yes, I am in one that he did, and of course he kills me at the end of the story. I'm disemboweled at the end, and I said, "Wow, you did a really nice job of murdering me, Richard." And he says, "Well, I did my best." Yeah. But yeah, I've
your
known,
face is pretty easily characterable. I can see that. Yeah. Caricatured.
And of course, he did this with some of these other friends too. And I got to know Richard shortly after I moved to Kansas City and discovered that there was a real comics illustrator living in the Kansas City area. Who knew? And I've met a few of the other artists that have since come on, but he was actually the second comic art. The first comic book artist I met was Russ Manning, who drew Magnus Robot Fighter and his backup feature, The Aliens, for Gold Key Comics, and this was back when I was living in Santa Ana, California. He came over to some friend's house one day who he knew, and he was actually the first comic artist I ever met, and he was one of the ones I idolized because he was a hell of an illustrator. And he went on to do the Tarzan comic strip, the Star Wars comic strip, and other things before he passed away. In fact, they named an award for him at the San Diego Comic-Con. So he was a very interesting guy. I saw him. He looked like he'd been on an all-night bender for 3 days, and he was trying to finish a strip to get it turned in on deadline. In fact, he just delivered a series to Gold Key, and he was on his way back home, and he was all unshaven, and he looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days, and he'd really burned the midnight oil finishing up the strip. And then, fortunately, having dropped off the artwork, he couldn't show us any of the stuff that he was getting ready to turn in. If he had come over before he dropped it off, we could have seen the whole completed Russ Manning comic strip.
Cool.
So it was years. In fact, it was years before I actually saw original comic art. Was Richard Corbin's original comic
The only thing I've ever really looked at from Gold Key at all is the early Star Trek comics. Gold Key was the first publisher to do that, and there's some cartoon stuff. They did some...
in the 60s, they did Dr. Solar, Man of the Atom, which I think is a character that still exists under
somebody's actually doing those again. Yeah. It might be Dynamite. I'm not sure.
And there was the Magnus Robot Fighter. Now, the Magnus Robot Fighter was actually a science fiction hero. He was always fighting robots. And there was a backup feature called The Aliens in the back of that. And it wasn't technically a superhero, but hey, he wore the same outfit, and he was always decapitating nasty, enemy alien robots and stuff. So yeah, he was a superhero kind of with costume.
So how do you go from a fan going to conventions to running them or helping with behind the scenes stuff?
I began reading about comic conventions and really wanting to attend them, but of course I was nowhere near when I lived in California. There was comic conventions were mostly the ones that had started were on the East Coast, and I think about as farther west as they got was maybe Detroit of all places. And one of the reasons that I started the Kansas City Science Fiction and Fantasy Society with my friend Gary was in the hopes that someday we could found a convention here in Kansas City and have something that we could go to. That was kind of a long-term goal. But
you probably never thought about how much work the logistics were.
Well, I should explain to your listeners that I'd always been kind of an organizer as a kid. When we would play war and my block would fight the next kid's block, I was usually the armory because I was a collector. I had all the stuff. And I was usually the general, and I had studied some battle tactics and so forth. So I'd always organize stuff. I did this when I was in grade school and high school. So this organizational side of me started to really emerge. And I didn't know a damn thing about running a convention. But I read everything.
But you knew how to plan things.
I knew how to plan things, and I started reading wherever I could how you did this kind of thing. And I started to extrapolate from that.
Yeah.
And it was from that I set out a 5-year plan in Kansas City to start a fan club that was open to everybody: science fiction, fantasy, horror, comics, pulp magazines, anything that fans were interested in is what the Kansas City Science Fiction and Fantasy Society would be about. It was supposed to be a gathering spot for collectors, for readers, for fans, together once a month in a social situation. And the natural outgrowth of that is to do a convention. Less than a year before the club was even a year old, we held our first convention downtown at the Continental Hotel. And, of course, we lost our shirts putting it on. But it began a long, enduring tradition and that has never stopped. And this last conquest was Conquest 44. And so that was the 44th regional convention that we held here in Kansas City. And from that first one in 1972 to the one last May, there's been an unbroken continuity. We are Kansas City's oldest convention. Now, there are other conventions in Kansas City. There's MidAmericaCon, which is the big anime convention. And, of course, there's, Kansas City is not a stranger to comic conventions.
Right.
Hasn't been for quite some time. And now, I believe it and Kansas City's convention, Planet Comic Con, and NakaCon are the two biggest fan conventions in the Kansas City area.
And Conquest is more of a literature con.
Well, yeah, Conquest is more oriented towards
it's
the
other
literary.
things, but
it's many other things.
It's mostly oriented. I mean, it's a lot of writers and readers that come to that primarily.
And the reason for that is that all fandom, whether you're in comics fandom or you're in anime fandom or Star Trek fandom or name a fandom, it all started with the fandom that began organizing in the 1930s around the science fiction pulp magazines. So it's not surprising that we kind of celebrate the original origins of all the fandoms, and that is the literary side. Now, we're not strictly devoted to that.
No, not
entirely,
at all.
No. In fact, neither was the Kansas City Science Fiction.
But it's the only con I've ever seen that I've ever been to that's had as much of an emphasis on that.
Right. And when you think about it, if it hadn't been for all of these writers creating all of these fantastical things,
we wouldn't have all the movies and the comics.
We wouldn't have the comics. And some of your listeners probably don't realize that a number of science fiction professionals were also involved in comics. Like I mentioned, Julie Swartz is an editor. Mm-hmm. The late Alfred Bester wrote the original Green Lantern Oath for the Golden Age.
I did not know that.
And other science fiction writers have worked in comics in tandem because they were another way to make income. And so, and they're in science fiction fandom itself, in the 50s in particular, when we saw the specialty fandoms starting to spin off from the main body of science fiction, there were always a hardcore group of people who were raised on comics, who read comics, who loved comics, both strips and comic books. And so comics have always been part of the science fiction firmament. So it was just a step, from there. But my primary allegiance these days is probably to literary science fiction, of course, science fiction films. But my humble origins in comics have not left me, and I have a huge respect for the comics business.
Yeah.
And I do collect a little bit in it. I try to keep it marginal. I pity the poor collector who's trying to read and collect in today's atmosphere.
It's hard.
It is impossible. If you want to be a completist, I hope you have lots and lots of money.
You've got to make 6 figures almost.
You really do,
everything.
And to go after everything would be a full-time job.
Yep.
And in a great way, in a strange way, it's kind of like the way it was.
You wouldn't have enough space.
Well, you couldn't.
Where would you put it?
Imagine now. When I sold my collection in the 1970s, I had about 6,000 comics. Mm-hmm. That's not a small collection.
No, it's not.
Imagine if I'd been collecting, if I'd kept those.
That's a little more than what I had.
And I was collecting everything that's come out since 1975. I would probably have 30,000.
Yeah.
Where do you put 30,000 comics in an average home?
You can't.
You can't. You need almost a warehouse. Imagine just what the cost of The boxes, the backing boards, and the plastic sleeves will cost you just to bag and board all of those comics, let alone the time it would take to read all of those comics.
I've talked to the actor Phil Morris, who played Martian Manhunter in Smallville, and at a couple cons, and he and I have talked a couple times, and he actually is a comics collector, so he was always fun to talk to.
Right.
And he says he owns 20,000, and he has them in a storage facility because he doesn't have the space for them.
And I would suspect that among younger readers and collectors of comics, they just slip their thumb drive into their computer and they go to one of the websites where you can download the latest issues.
Yeah.
And as big as thumb drives storage capacities are these days, you could probably get 5,000 comics on one.
Well, in fact, that's not the way
drive.
it works with digital these days.
No?
No, I mean, like when you go to Comixology, you're basically paying to read them on their website.
Yeah.
So
they don't allow you to actually download them? Okay.
I think you can in some way or another, but most people just leave them in a list. You know, they're
right.
on the website or whatever. And but the thing about it is, you still would have to make a fortune to buy them all because they cost the same.
The cost the same.
The cost is exactly the same.
And I don't know about you
right now. I mean, except when they have sales or whatever. But like day and day, if you want to buy them the day it comes out. A $3.99 comic is a $3.99 comic.
Well, I'll tell you from the very beginnings of comic fandom, and this would be 1961, semi-officially. Comics have always been a collecting medium.
Yeah.
Physically collecting medium. There's never been a time in fandom's history, comic fandom's history, where that just wasn't the case. If you were a reader, more than likely you were a collector.
And that's the reason digital hasn't killed the print.
Right. And I applaud there being digital comics. If you want to go out and read,
too.
Let's say you don't want to read, name a title, but you're kind of interested in it, and the ones you really want to collect are the ones you can really afford. But you want to read some of the other comics. The digital comics are a great medium, and I think that they will probably continue to parallel the physical comic book itself for quite some time.
And I've said this before, we've done more than one show on digital comics, and I always like to say that one of the big things that's really nice also about digital is that people in other countries that can't get them can buy them now.
That's right, and that increases your market. Now, I feel that all these multiple covers that comics publishers are producing is really slowly strangling the comics market.
Do you think?
I think so, because I might consider collecting other comics if I wasn't a completist and had to have all these variant covers to keep my Shadow and my Rocketeer and a few other titles that I collect complete. I might say if there's only 2 covers, like for instance, IDW is now down to just 2 covers per issue of their current Rocketeer series, which links the Rocketeer up with the Spirit. Great series so far. And so that's very manageable. 2 comics, no big deal. When there's 7 or 8 covers, that's a deal because the smaller circulation ones get more expensive as you go
They hit your pocketbook, and then you can't buy as many times.
And you can't buy as many comics. And now I should also tell you that in addition to buying the individual comics, when they bring them out as graphic novels, I buy those.
Oh, you buy the trades too?
I buy the trades
too.
Because what am I?
You're a completist.
I'm a completist, exactly.
And that is very often also a different cover.
And that's a different cover. And in fact, they are now doing.
Do you get the hard copy? Do you get the hardback and the paperback?
Yes.
Oh man.
Because in some cases they're slightly different. They'll have a title on one, and on another one they won't have the title. The direct market title will not have an actual title on the front.
Well, it's good you don't collect very much DC and Marvel anymore, because you'd get stuck buying the $100 Absolute editions and all that stuff.
Oh, well, some of that stuff they have in the narrow range of comics that I currently collect. They haven't started doing any of those yet.
But it'll happen.
But it's going to happen, and my pocketbook is already screaming at me. In fact, I went through. Now I buy my comics online. I buy through Midtown Comics in New York, and Buddy Saunders, my comic shop down in the Dallas area. In fact, I've known Buddy for many, many years. And I use both of those of my major suppliers, and I just have them shipped in because I know if I go to all the comic book stores here in the Kansas City area, I will not be able to find all the variants.
Even if you got a pull-list set up and pulled them all, they still might not always get them in.
And they may not always get them, and this has been very frustrating. Sometimes even Midtown misses a cover. In fact, I'm looking for Masks number 8A because for some reason nobody got it, and that I've been trying. And I've been trying to find
you have
it.
accidental low print runs. You have things where they meant to print a certain number, and for whatever reason, that many didn't get hammered or didn't ship out right.
Well, because it was an A cover and because it was the last of the series, it may have sold out for their current buy at the store, and they were just gone before, and they couldn't offer it to their online readers as much. So sometimes there are frustrations, even to this day, collecting comics. And then when you figure in all of the figures and all the related stuff that's spun off of comics, I pity the poor collector who collects comics and ephemera these days. It must be maddening to some people to try and keep up with all this stuff, because it certainly is to me. And this is largely one of the reasons why I gave up on comics in the 70s, because more and more titles were being produced, and my interest in comics at that time was becoming less and less as my interest in science fiction was growing and growing stronger.
Well, obviously, the more your interest grows in one area, the more you start dividing your income between things. If you're a collector like you.
Yeah, and most collectors that I know have a certain set budget that they have to stay within.
And some sort of a niche.
And a niche. And these days, most of the comics readers that I know are niche readers or niche collectors.
Right.
One of the first niche collectors that I ever met, not personally, but I knew of him, was a fan in the 1960s called Bill Joe White, who lived in Columbia, Missouri, just 2.5 hours from here. He was the Batman fan of comic fandom. He was the authority on the Batman. He published a wonderful fanzine called Batmania. He was a fireman for the Columbia, Missouri Fire Department. And he was known as being not only one of Fandom's biggest collectors, but Fandom's authority on Batman. And unfortunately, I never got to meet him. He died shortly after I moved to Missouri, and I was never able to meet him. I always wanted to, but there wasn't anything about Batman that he didn't know. And he had it all. In fact, he even had original Batman artwork from the Golden Age.
Wow, that's really
pages
cool.
from the Golden Age. A couple of them signed to him by Bob Kane. Anyway, getting back to the current track, yes,
absolutely.
I do collect comics. I have a great respect for the medium. It's one of America's true art forms. It's one of the 3 or 4 that we've actually created.
Yeah, right.
And
it's up there with jazz.
The permutation of comics through our culture is pretty well saturated. I mean, the current big blockbuster films, mostly from Marvel, have established a superhero subculture in the popular culture in the United States that isn't going to go away anytime soon.
And we're also to a point where you will inevitably, probably if you're a regular moviegoer, go to a film in any given year now that you don't know is based on a comic book until you get there.
In fact, my old friend George R. R. Martin, the best-selling fantasy writer who writes the
Game of Thrones.
He's the co-executive producer on Game of Thrones, which is based on his fantasy series, is the longtime editor and creator of the Wild Cards series, superhero and prose anthology series.
I would really like to talk to him about that at some point.
Which has been going since 1987, and in fact, there's a new Wild Cards book coming out in next year, and I think it's 22 or 23, and I know there's another one they've already signed a contract.
Is he just producing those, or is he doing anything writing-wise?
Well, right now he's so busy with all his other demands that he's just editing the series. He hasn't actually contributed to the Wild Card series, but we have to remember these are shared world anthologies with multiple collaborators, including some from the comics. Chris Claremont was
oh, really? I didn't know Claremont worked on that.
Worked on one of the earlier Wild Card series.
Very cool. Yeah.
It's what it's called the Wild Card Consortium. And so, if
you were telling me about that, but you didn't mention Claremont. That's cool.
Well, Claremont is one of them, and a number of fantasy and science fiction writers have worked on the series, and all of them have this common affinity for comics. They either were, like, for instance, my old friend Pat Cadigan, who lives in London, just won a Hugo Award at the World Science Fiction Convention, was a longtime comics reader, read DC Comics at the same time I was reading DC Comics, and she was a member of the consortium in its earlier days, in the 80s and early 90s, when she wrote for the series. So behind every science fiction writer, I would say about at least a third of them, maybe half of them, have been or still are comics readers.
Well, and I also want to mention for people that haven't heard of it, know what it is, that Wild Cards is superhero prose, not comic book.
It's not a comic book. It's superheroes in prose form.
Yeah.
And these are what are called blended novels. Each chapter and sometimes paragraphs are written by different writers, and they are blended into a mosaic novel. And
that's so interesting.
The whole Wild Card universe is set on the premise that an alien virus has been set loose basically over Manhattan in 1947, and it has caused mutations in the human genome. And if you get the good mutation, you're a hero. You've developed some kind of superpowers. And if you draw the Black Queen, you're known as a joker. because you can be horribly disfigured or killed outright or be transformed into what is a monster. The Deuces have a superpower, but it's an inconsequential superpower. It's like you have the ability to light a match, but that's all you can do.
I'm sure that immediately creates a nature versus nurture motif.
Yes. And the Jokers, of course, live in Joker Town, where they're segregated, and the Aces are the ones who've developed superpowers. And there are good Aces, there are bad Aces.
Well, right.
And the whole note of this is to treat superheroes in a realistic fashion, so that how would superheroes manifest themselves in real life? Now, this idea has been done a couple of times in movies on television, but Wildcards is the originator of that entire concept, and that was from 1987.
Oh, okay, so it's post-Watchmen then.
So it's just immediately post-Watchmen. And I think Wildcards 23 is going to be the new book. Now, there is a Wildcards movie under development at Universal. Universal's looking to launch its own superhero series.
Do you think it'll happen?
Well, you never know in pre-production.
Right.
Belinda Snodgrass, who's the co-editor on the Wildcard series, and also
Snodgrass wrote a lot of TNG.
She was the story editor on Star Trek: Next Generation back in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. She's also in her own right a well-known science fiction writer. She's worked on a lot of shows in Hollywood, so she straddles both science fiction and television pretty effectively. And she's turned in a second draft of the Wildcards feature film to Universal. And, anyone who knows anything about Hollywood production knows that it goes on. It takes forever.
Ad infinitum sometimes.
Your average film takes 4 to 5 years to go from pitch to on the screen. And sometimes it takes much longer than that. So I'm hoping sometime in the next 2 years, Universal will have its own superhero franchise with the Wildcard series. Not only because I'd like to have Wildcards read by a larger audience, and I'm hoping that would happen once the movies started. But I can highly recommend.
It almost sounds like something that would make for a better miniseries or television show.
Well, of course they've done miniseries that are kind of like the Heroes miniseries is kind of this idea, and
it is. Heroes is really similar to that.
It's very similar to it, although it wasn't an alien engineered virus that mutates the culture and changes the human genome. But the basic idea of real life superheroes among us. Of course, X-Men has...
Now, are they in costume at all in Wildcards?
Well, to a degree, like the Great and Powerful Turtle.
Just curious, because of course Heroes is in.
The Great and Powerful Turtle, which is George R. R. Martin's character, he's a telekinetic. He has massive telekinetic abilities.
Okay.
And like a turtle, he has a shell. And in the very early stages of his shell, it's a Volkswagen Beetle, an armored Volkswagen Beetle, which he's concocted, and he fights various menaces from inside his Volkswagen Beetle shell.
Volkswagen Beetle shell. That's awesome.
So in that sense, that was kind of a fun takeoff on the notion of a superhero. But there are others who don't wear costumes necessarily. Some have wings and
have some
fly.
kind of gimmick. Yeah.
There was one of my favorite early characters was Kid Dinosaur, who unfortunately is killed. He's just a young boy, and he's ultimately killed in the series. But he could transform into any dinosaur that you would ever imagine. Anyone that because he loved dinosaurs. And at the moment, he was exposed to the wildcard virus. He was thinking of dinosaurs, and so of course he became an ace. And could transform himself into any dinosaur shape or size that you can imagine. And that could be a pretty formidable power, depending on who you're fighting. But, of course, he's killed off in the series early on. I hope I won't ruin that for any of your readers who want to decide to go out and read Wildcards. And the Wildcard series...
That might get them to want to.
Yeah, the earlier Wildcard books are now coming back into print.
Oh, good.
You can buy them from Tor Books, and I highly recommend them if you read prose of any kind, whether it's science fiction, fantasy, or whatever. I highly recommend the Wildcard series because the amount of talent that's been brought to the fore for the Wildcard series. These are superheroes done as realistic creations. And so I didn't mean to actually get off onto the Wildcard.
Oh, that's all right. I was interested, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, what do you say we transition back?
Absolutely.
After I had to Fandom and how I got involved in convention.
Yeah, get us to your heyday as an organizer.
Well, as an organizer, I had always planned as part of my master plan for Kansas City Fandom to establish a regional convention that we would do every year. And people would come to our convention, and this would be one of the foundation stones for developing an ongoing, sustainable fandom. I looked at the models, and all the successful fan clubs around the country all had stable, long-term conventions. So I extrapolated from that, and we started. And our first convention was in 1972. We gave it the name of MidAmericaCon, which, of course, we're Mid-America right here. And we had science fiction writers Philip Jose Farmer and James Gunn from the University of Kansas, not very far away, as our guests of honor. But we did have a comics guest, in addition to having Richard Corbin there and a Richard Corbin art show, which was the first time Richard displayed any of his artwork. We did three art shows, and they were each day we had a different art show. And boy, that was logistically complex to tear down and set up every day, but we did it. But we had Russ Myers, the cartoonist, who was the creator of the Broomhilda comic strip, which I believe is still running. Broomhilda is a witch, and it's a funny series. And it was a 3 or 4 panel daily comic strip with a Sunday. And Russ at the time lived in Kansas City, and so he came in and did a cartoon demonstration and brought in a collection of his original comic strip art and had on display. So at that first convention, we had Richard Corbin and we had Russ Myers as two of our guests. We also had Vernon and Rita Coriel of the Burroughs Bibliophiles. The National Edgar Rice Burroughs fan club was centered here in Kansas City at that time, and they were technically our fan guests of honor. And that was our first convention, and as I said earlier, we lost our shirts on that one, but we didn't lose our shirts so badly that we didn't want to do it again. And for the next couple of years, we put on some what are called relaxicons. They don't have guests. They're but mostly to socialize. Maybe we show a few movies. We talk. We get together. There was a little dealers.
So they're still planned and organized.
It's still planned and organized. There's a small dealers room area, but it was largely there as a socializing function to build the friendship bonds between collectors and fans. That was the whole point of them. And we call those BYOB cons, and BYOB.
You don't see a lot of that anymore.
No, BYOB.
There's always a guest.
Yeah,
at most of your conventions.
And there are a few relaxicons that still happen, but you're right. Most of them usually have some kind of a guest. But and we drew fans from around the Midwest, and I think we maybe had 150 people at the BYOB cons 1 through 3. With 4, we decided to do a full-fledged regional convention again. And that was at the Mielbach Hotel, and we'd had a full slate of guests and so forth. And that really is what started our progress toward doing a sustainable, with guests, regional convention. So from 72 to now, we've had that unbroken string. And 75, which was BYOBCon 5, was our shakedown cruise for the 34th World Science Fiction Convention. By that time, I had mounted a bid with other Kansas Cityans to bring the World Science Fiction Convention to Kansas City.
Yeah, can you explain to everybody how that works? It moves around.
Worldcon, unlike Comic-Con, which stays in San Diego, Worldcon moves around from city to city and has since it began in 1939.
And groups bid on it.
And cities bid on it, and it's an international convention. Next year, it's going to be in London. Then it's coming back to Spokane in the United States.
Oh, I thought it was just America. I didn't realize.
No. It's an international. It's been in Japan. It's been in England.
Yeah, it's called Worldcon, but I didn't realize that it was very often in other places.
Well, there was a time when it wasn't Worldcon. It was really,
all right.
But the first Worldcon overseas was in London.
I knew I wasn't crazy.
No, it was in 1957. LonCon 1 was held, and that was the first international convention. And from that point on, you began seeing an occasional foreign bidder. And now foreign bidders are fairly regular. You'll see it going in a decade, at least twice or maybe 3 times you'll see it go out of the country.
Well, and Fandom is so worldwide.
Well, and you're right. And the internet, remember, in my era back that I'm talking about right now, there was no internet. Can you imagine a world without the internet? It's hard for even me to remember a time when we didn't have it, when we were all joined together by this instantaneous...
And at least I've had it for a lot of my lifetime. You didn't.
I didn't. In fact, I didn't buy my first computer till 1985, so I was kind of a late adopter when it comes to that kind of thing. But I've had computers now for close to 30 plus years.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine a time if
now the walls have really kind of come down.
Oh yeah, all the fandoms have kind of merged and blended, and you don't even have to go to a science fiction convention these days to meet your fellow fans. You can go right online to any number of forums, comics, fantasy, science fiction, and
you can meet
jump right in.
Video chat on Skype. I mean, everybody can get to know each other face to face.
Face to face, it's the walls have more or less fallen down. I will say this: there's nothing like being at a convention in person. person, there's a completely different atmosphere.
Oh, absolutely,
there.
of course.
That face-to-face
And that's
contact,
true of everything.
That face-to-face contact, hearing real people talking about real events, going up to a dealer's table and seeing mounds of stuff that you would love to own, walking the floors, seeing the exhibits, going to the panel discussions.
There's a lot of gaming that happens at conventions
There's
now.
a lot of both board gaming and online gaming.
And interactivity, yeah.
It's you name it. Usually, you can find it happening at even at the World Science Fiction Convention. Worldcon isn't strictly about the literature. You'll see a lot of. There's always a film program. In fact, this year there was an international film competition going on at Worldcon for in various categories for fantasy, science fiction, horror, and superhero related films. So quite literally, there's more going on at a Worldcon, like a Comic-Con, than you can possibly attend. You will kill yourself if you try to see them all. So what you have to do is plan what you're most interested in, and then the other things that you want to do, like if there's any historic things, like we had the Alamo 2 blocks away from us. And I have to sorrily say I never made it up to the Alamo.
Oh, no!
I never saw the Alamo, and I was born in Texas. So I'm clearly going to have to go back at some point.
Ken, how can you remember the Alamo if you never go to the Alamo?
Exactly. You can't remember the Alamo if you can't go there. Although I've seen it many days. Well, anyway, we're getting off the track.
No, absolutely.
So after we did these first few conventions, on my master plan was hosting a World Science Fiction Convention. Now, my original plan had been to do it in 1979. That would give us enough time to organize and develop our fandom here locally, learn our organizational skills, learn who could do what, become friends, and then collectively put in a bid to bring the World Science Fiction Convention to Kansas City. Now, I should mention that Worldcon is the oldest convention there is. It is the grandfather of all conventions that you've ever heard of. The first one was in 1939 in New York City. And there's been a Worldcon every year except during World War II from 43 through 45. There was one there wasn't one in 42 through 45. But there's been a Worldcon every year since then. Worldcon is the convention that gives out the Hugo Awards, which some of your listeners may have.
I didn't realize that's where Hugo happened.
Yeah, the Hugo always are presented by the World Science Fiction Society at the World Science Fiction Convention every year, regardless of where it is.
Where it is, okay.
I was at the ceremony and saw 2 of my friends win this year, which was quite exciting. And one of them, George R. R. Martin, won a Hugo, and he asked me to be his Hugo bearer the rest of the night. And so I proudly carried his Hugo around to all the room parties, and I got into a very exclusive room party that was a invitation guests only list. And of course, when you're holding a Hugo Award, the doors are flung wide open and no one asks for your party pass.
Yeah.
For your invitation.
That's fun.
So that was a great.
Did you meet any cool people that I would know?
Oh my God!
Those room parties?
Well, let's see. Let me see. I'm trying to know. I don't really know who you know. So.
Did you meet any really cool famous people while you're up there?
Well, let's see. I'm trying to remember. There's of course there was a lot of science fiction personalities there.
Absolutely.
Some of which I know. Some of which I've met before. I'm trying to think if I could mention anyone. Well, of course, George R. R. Martin. If you watch Game of Thrones on HBO, George is the co-executive producer, and he writes 1 episode per season. George is an old friend of mine. I've known him for 42 years. So I could name drop him if that's impressive. But I got George on my speed dial. I can call him up anytime and razz him for something, or he can call and razz me for something, So when you're old friends with, I don't really think of George as a celebrity, but he really is.
But he is.
He's become a huge celebrity thanks to the series. So he would probably be the biggest one. One of the stars from HBO was there with George to accept the Hugos for a dramatic presentation, long form.
Cool.
And there were quite a few science fiction editors and writers.
Well, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I was just curious.
I did meet. I did meet finally for the first time. God, I'm trying to remember his name. He's huge in comics and science fiction. Neil Gaiman.
Oh, did you? Very cool.
Neil Gaiman is a wonderful guy. He's funny, easy to talk to. Has lots of stories. I've admired Neil Gaiman for many years because he's straddled. He's one of those writers who straddled both comics,
absolutely.
and fantasy and science fiction.
He's like Greg Rucka.
Yeah.
He's like Peter David.
Yeah, he like us, grew up reading comics, grew up reading science fiction, and so he saw the connectivity.
Well, you can tell he's one of those writers that writes the kind of stuff that he loves to read, and that's part of why it's so much fun to read, because it's just entertaining, a lot of it,
And I met him thanks to George, because he and George R. R. Martin are old friends.
I didn't realize that.
I had been at conventions where Neil was, but I never had the real opportunity to actually meet him. But at the Hugo Losers Party, which is a big party that's held, which actually George started at my Worldcon back in 1976. George introduced me to Neil Gaiman, and I'd always wanted to meet Neil, and we chatted briefly for a while, and it was very pleasant. And of course, he has just look at what he's done, just amazing. The Sandman alone will remain a character in the comics field that I think will be well remembered as name your favorite superhero, and the Sandman will probably be as remembered as any of those.